Your Royal Highness, Lord Lieutenant, High Sheriff, Lord Mayor, distinguished guests, Mr. President, and members of the Association, I'm very grateful to be invited to give this eponymous lecture. In this, we commemorate two issues. Firstly, the highly significant contribution made by George James Guthrie to military medicine, and secondly, the bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo, as has been mentioned, a momentous event which brought about the end of a 22-year war against revolutionary and then Napoleonic France. That war had cost the loss of lives of around 4 million Europeans, and a greater proportional loss of life in the British population than the 1914-18 cataclysm at around 2.5%. I'd also like to thank the Royal College of Surgeons of England and the Royal Centre for Defence Medicine for their assistance with some data. For the past decade or so, we've witnessed some impressive advances in transport, in-transit management, damage control, resuscitation and surgery for combat casualties, all of which have amounted to an impressive pre-repatriation survival. And yet it's hard to imagine, without antisepsis, anesthesia and a modern understanding of normal and trauma physiology, how any significant success would have been feasible 200 years ago. When we look at the attrition list at the Battle of Waterloo, besides the Herrick operation, we see a higher wound-to-kill ratio in the recent data and a broadly similar in-hospital survival, which seems surprising. But of course the latter data are spurious, since in 1815 very few casualties who would have survived today even got to hospital. In fact, it was an indicator of survival to get to hospital. Disparate as these series are, they do reflect highly impressive advances. So let us turn to George James Guthrie. Anthony Bowlby, just after the World War I, correctly pointed out that these great advances over the last 200 years really commenced in the 19th century, and the names of Dominic Larrey and George Guthrie are very prominent in that parade. Here is Guthrie, in the left, a pen and ink sketch rescued from the skip outside the demolished Westminster Hospital where he served, and on the right there is a portrait by Henry Roome at the Royal College of Surgeons and shows Guthrie in his early 50s. Guthrie was born in London, where he lived, a Celtic background, some controversial religious forebears, and Guthrie's father took over a business from Guthrie's uncle, who was a naval surgeon dealing with medical supplies. One gets the impression that the father had little time for Guthrie and rather left him to his own devices. And if we look at the normal schooling of somebody anticipating entrance to the armed services medicine, you finish school at 15, you were apprenticed by indenture for 5 years, and then went on to be a pupil for 2 years, attending courses and walking the wards. And then you took an exam and were ready to be an assistant surgeon to a ship, hospital, or regiment. But Guthrie was schooled by Monsieur Noël, who was an émigré teacher. He taught Guthrie languages and mathematics, dead reckoning and navigation. And by the age of 13, he was well-knowledged, and in fact had a serious accident. And the military surgeon who looked after him pointed out that he would make a good military surgeon. So he was apprenticed to Dr. Hooper of Marylebone, a well-known physician, Mr. Phillips of Pall Mall, surgeon in ordinary to the Prince of Wales, and he then took on that apprenticeship for only 2 years. He was an acting hospital mate, unqualified and unpaid, working at the York Hospital after the evacuation from the Helder expedition in 1799 with a lot of casualties. Because Surgeon Keat suggested that everyone should be qualified who was working in a hospital, he fled to the college, unlike his colleagues, and took the membership of our College of Surgeons in England and passed well. He was appointed assistant surgeon to the 29th Regiment, or Worcestershire Regiment, at the age of 16. The regiment, incidentally, was commanded by a colonel aged 22. Here we can see the well-known picture of the Windmill School of Anatomy, which Guthrie attended with John and William Hunter. And there were other aids as well. Anatomy was, of course, very important. There was the written word, there were lectures, and of course in anatomy there was a paucity of cadaveric material because only about 70 to 100 criminals were available each year for dissection. So the reprehensible but inevitable practice of grave robbing had to supply the extramural schools in London. There were other aids. There were osseous specimens. Here a musket ball embedded in a young man's arm. Charles Bell's famous and evocative paintings from La Coruña and Waterloo, illustrations in book, they were fairly sparse. And this from St. Bartholomew's Hospital is a model for practicing trephining of the skull. So Guthrie worked in a ward that would have looked something like this near Chelsea, and he looked after some of the badly injured men from the Helder. When forced to take the examination, he sat in front of a master and 9 examiners. The examination was oral, and this was now, of course, the Royal College of Surgeons of London at that time. We don't really know what quality of examinations all these things were. They were oral, and no written evidence exists, except, ironically, Dr. Hooper himself had written a crib book for students taking the London exam. And for instance, question 303, what is the treatment of gunshot wounds? And one has to say that, okay, the answer and the question are very naive, and you realize how inappropriate the civilian training was for somebody taking the field into war. And it transpires over the history of war that the battlefield and some good teachers were the only way you were going to learn your practice. At this time, the medical staff of the forces in the British Army, we had 1,250 doctors for an army of 1/3 men, regulars. In the Royal Navy, they had more doctors for a smaller force because every ship, whatever size, had to have a surgeon. The French Revolution had actually kick-started new ideas in revolutionary medicine, and the French Army was 3 times our size, with 5,000 to 6,000 medical men. And the French, incidentally, lost 1 million men in this war. So Guthrie joins the Worcester, or 29th Regiment. These are 2 figures from that battalion. And they're stationed initially to Halifax. It's a quiescent backwater from the war, and the regiment was well known to the city, and Guthrie had a very splendid time there, operating, doing obstetrics, pediatrics, and so on. And the battalion was garrisoned, we're looking westwards now, up on near the Citadel. He was promoted full battalion surgeon in 1806 when he got married to Margaret Gordon, who was a widow of an apothecary. The marriage certificate cost £100, which in today's money is £6,800 to get married. And so this was a happy marriage, and they were homeward bound in 1807. And Guthrie's knowledge of dead reckoning saved his transport from being wrecked off the Isle of Wight, much to the amusement of the crew, and embarrassment too, no doubt. Then, after a short spell back in Britain, the regiment was dispatched south to the Mediterranean with General Brent Spencer's force of about 6,000 men. And they were to reduce the port of Ceuta because we were at war with Spain as well as France at this time. This is March 1808. And once again, Guthrie saved the ship from disaster, as no one in the crew had realized that the head mooring had come loose, and they were being fired on by the Spanish. Anyway, Portugal had been invaded by Marshal Andros Junot. They wanted British help, and so Guthrie's regiment was recalled up towards the west coast of Portugal. Ferdinand VII had been deposed by Bonaparte's brother Joseph, and there was a general uprising in Spain. So Wellesley, Sir Arthur Wellesley of great Indian fame, landed here off the coast here at Mondego Bay in August 1808. He took a force of about total 9,000 men. Guthrie was one of the last to disembark and had been separated from his instruments, unfortunately. He had 2 orderlies, most only had 1, but he'd amputated a hand each of his orderlies, so they worked together as one man. And most efficient, he said, that they were. And he found the heat searing, and they all disembarked and marched off towards the first battle of the Peninsular War, was fought near Columbira at a place called Roliça. We're looking south towards Lisbon, and the Atlantic is on our behind me and to the right. And General Delaborde's French force was over the hill here. Now, the young Colonel Lake was a bit precipitous in his attack, and the 29th worked their way, hopefully unobserved, up this defile here. But in fact, they were taken enfilade and in front by Delaborde's force, and they took high casualties. Lake's advance had been a bit precipitous. He was killed by a sharpshooter, and when Guthrie got to him, the sergeant major called Richards had received 17 wounds defending his colonel and died as Guthrie was with him. The battalion had suffered 118 casualties, some minor and some rather less minor. And Guthrie, instead of pulling his casualties back down the hill, took them on a kilometre to a village called Zambugira. He realized on the battlefield not only how upset he was at seeing so many friends damaged, but that also he could only give water, bind wounds, and prevent hemorrhage. That's all he could do. So he got the casualties on to the next little town. He was reunited with his capital set of instruments, which obviously include things for amputation, trimming wounds, trephining the skull, and so on. The technique of amputation at this time, under, of course, full tourniquet control, was called a guillotine operation, performed with a circular knife, and after division of the bone, the arteries were taken up and the wound closed. It took about 15 minutes in skilled hands. And the technique was to change during this war, and Guthrie promulgated that change as the war went on. But during one of these amputations, his tourniquet snapped, and the bleeding, of course, was ferocious from the wound. So Guthrie quickly put his fingers on the femoral artery, and from then on, wherever possible, he eschewed the use of a tourniquet during surgery. And incidentally, this is the flap operation that developed later in the war, where there is better bone cover than during the guillotine procedure. He also noticed that men who'd, from legs removed or cadavers, that where a ball passed close to an artery, it looked intact, but in fact he observed that the internal structure of the artery had been completely disrupted. And he sent some of these specimens home to his friend Dr. Hooper. For 3 days, Guthrie worked on the field with all his casualties and struggled down south, nearer to Lisbon, on the coast to Vamiro, where Wellesley's force had been bolstered a bit, and luckily the 29th only had 12 wounded after this battle. But Guthrie was shot through both calves, but he managed to go on treating his casualties in this church at the top of the hill in the village. The army was struck with a bad outcome of dysentery and moved down towards Lisbon. The French signed a surrender agreement, Marshal Junot, and they were repatriated home, the French, in British ships. And this caused a great outcry in Britain, and Wellesley and his two rather inept commanders were called home for an inquiry, leaving Guthrie and his battered regiment in Lisbon and, of course, many other men. Sir John Moore, with fresh troops, came to take over command, and he ventured out into northeast Spain in the winter of 1808 to chase the French out of Spain. But unfortunately, unknown to him, Bonaparte, with 200,000 fresh troops, had landed, and he was determined to chase the English leopard into the sea. And John Moore lost his arm and died at La Coruña, and the army had a very difficult retreat over the Galician mountains. The Navy played a grand part here in really acting out another Dunkirk at an earlier time. Wellesley was exonerated. He came back quickly. Within 3 weeks of his landing in Lisbon, he had an army of about 20,000 men marching north up the west coast of Portugal to Porto, where Marshal Soult had instigated the second invasion of Portugal, and Wellesley was going to chase him out. The main force crossed under this convent on the Douro, but about a quarter of a mile downstream, Guthrie hailed a boat in Portuguese. He'd learnt both Spanish and Portuguese, and he got across, finding a deserted city. He found a good Spanish mule and took that and became somewhat dislocated from his regiment. So he joined some Portuguese troops dressed in blue, rather like the French. And as he approached his own battalion, the Grenadier Company came up to the present to annihilate these Frenchmen coming towards them. So Guthrie ripped open his watch coat and showed them his red coat and saved them from destruction. Much to the amusement of his commanding officer, Guthrie also captured a piece of French ordnance. As he saw it moving off, he cut all the traces and brought the gun up to his commanding officer. So, Porto has been relieved, the second invasion of Portugal is over, Soult has been chased out, but there is a new threat from Madrid. Marshal Victor and King Joseph are advancing with a large French army, and they are met by a hastily assembled army of British and Spanish troops at Talavera. This is a difficult battle. It's very hot, of course, and the armies faced each other, facing north-south above the city of Talavera. Guthrie is stationed up here with Stuart's brigade. This is his hospital. The little building still exists, but of course all his casualties were tracked down onto the city on the River Tagus. He wanted to have his own casualties near to him in a house. He did not want his casualties from the battalion mixed in with all the others because of the spread of contagion. And although they didn't know the nature of spread, they knew it was a risk. So he operated in a private dwelling on his own casualties. And amusingly, one doctor wandered in and found Guthrie, who had just performed a trepanation operation to relieve pressure on the brain, and he found Guthrie delicately brushing the extradural clot off the dura with a feather. And I think that tells us, ladies and gentlemen, that some of these operations weren't quite as crude as we might think. This is a naive portrait of Guthrie at Talavera, and he took a deep interest in chest injury. His great promotion was primary closure of chest wounds and appropriate drainage with accumulation of fluid or blood inside the chest. He advised also that a lung hernia, if occurred, should be left as a dressing and a plug to prevent air ingress into the chest. Unfortunately, Victor and Joseph had reinforcements, and Marshal Soult was threatening Wellesley's rear from the north, so the army had to retire quickly from Talavera, across the Tagus, and down towards De La Tosa, and on to Trujillo and back to Portugal. At De La Tosa, there were great criticisms by Guthrie of his colleagues, who were obviously performing far too many amputations, particularly of the upper limb. But he had no fear for his reputation in such criticisms. At Trujillo, amusingly, somebody noticed that Guthrie's regimental hospital grave line was shorter than anybody else's. He got ill. When he came into the Guadiana Valley, south of the Tagus, he got probably benign tertian malaria, and he was carted off from Abrantes to Lisbon, and he was absent from Spain for about 10 months. During that 10 months, Wellesley had gone north and attacked Massena at the Battle of Busaco and had a brilliant victory there, but retired behind the lines of Torres Vedras, which he'd secretly built, to protect the army and build up their strength. And of course, the French just blew themselves to bit on the defensive lines. Guthrie missed all this, but he came back after the Massena had been chased out of Portugal at the end of the last and third invasion, and Guthrie was now staff surgeon to Sir Lowry Cole's division. After attending 2 failed sieges, the next thing was to tackle the problems on the border. Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz were 2 very strongly defended and French-held fortresses, and they had to be taken before anything else could be done. But the first thing that happened in 1811 was that 2 severe French attempts to relieve Almeida and Ciudad Rodrigo and at Badajoz were fought off at the battles of Fuentes de Nero and Albuera. Albuera was a very sticky battle indeed. It was the only battle in the peninsula that Wellington was not present at, and the casualty rates were extremely high because of close-fought infantry firefights, particularly on the flank here. And Guthrie worked initially out in the field, retired to the little village, and it really was a most bloody affair. The French and us, between us, suffered around 6,000 and 7,000 casualties each, and some of the attrition rates in the battalions were extremely high. It was raining, there was no wood because it had all been burnt in the village, there were no bearers, there was no system of evacuation, and Guthrie was the only responsible surgeon apart from the regimental doctors. And during this battle, in which he worked tirelessly for 3 weeks, he made the point that if you tie off an artery which has been wounded below your ligature, you must tie it off below the wound as well. And many men had succumbed from back bleeding. which was an important lesson. Next year, 1812, as Bonaparte starts to consider the invasion of Russia, most unwisely, Wellington takes his opportunity of taking the border fortresses of Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz. And he goes out, wins the Battle of Salamanca, which is the El Alamein of the Peninsular War, enters Madrid in triumph, but goes too far and fails at the siege of Burgos and retires all the way back to North Portugal. A very busy year for the British Army. This is the Great Breach at Ciudad Rodrigo, and here the Lesser Breach, in which General Bob Crawford of the Light Division was killed from a chest wound. Guthrie had at least half the surgical workload, and he performed either post-mortems or surgery on some eminent future leaders, military leaders, and he believed again in regimental hospitals, not big general hospitals, and he actually put a lot of his men over 10 kilometers from the battle site. He got a reprimand for this from the Adjutant General, but after a really stout defense by Guthrie, the adjutant had to back down. But the momentous event at Ciudad Rodrigo in January was that James McGrigor arrived, an Aberdonian who completely transformed the British Army's Army Medical Department during this war and became a faithful servant of it and of Wellington. He was brilliant at reorganization, bringing necessary bureaucracy and upping the morale of the British Army. And he got on fairly well with Guthrie. Then they had to finally tackle Badajoz. This was going to be a very nasty business, and so it was. They only just managed to take it, and there were high casualty rates in all the breaches, particularly. They couldn't get into the town to look after their wounded in convents and things because the Allied army had gone berserk with drink, and for 2 days Guthrie had to work in field tent hospitals outside the town. And the Duke was visibly moved when he saw the casualties in the breach. But he'd taken the 2 fortresses. He could move out of Portugal, so to Salamanca, where Marshal Marmont had a very strong army fielded against the Allied force, and with a brilliant victory, Wellington gained the great victory at Salamanca. Now, Salamanca was about 5 miles from the battlefield, very dry, very hot again. There were nearly 6,000 Allied casualties, and the local population were brilliant in their support of moving them back to the city. Overall, there were 13,500 admissions with a very high mortality. That's double the usual mortality rate in military hospitals in this war. And Guthrie is to be commended for his efforts to help 300 neglected French wounded. The Spanish had just cast them adrift, and Guthrie remonstrated with the authorities in no mean fashion to get them properly cared for. August the 12th, Wellington enters Madrid, Guthrie follows, and it's to be noted that a third of the British Army was sick during this campaign. And in fact, the range of sickness in the army was between 50 and 40% during this war. And that's a huge logistical problem for the Army Medical Department. Guthrie notices that some limbs are getting infected with the streptococcus, and he performs relaxing incisions to prevent the pressure from the swelling of the infection compressing the blood vessels. This is, of course, a superficial fasciotomy here, and of course, debridement originally, the word debridement originally means releasing tension. It doesn't mean what you all know that it means. In Madrid, Wellington was received rapturously, of course, and because Guthrie was so young, he took a brevet promotion to Deputy Inspector of Hospitals. Interesting to note that only the Medical and the Judge Advocates Department wear black plumes. Wellington went on to Burgos with half his force, inadequate siege artillery, and in the face of quite a lot of disease and casualties, he had this ignominious retreat all the way back to North Portugal. It was the lowest moment in Wellington's war. But he coped with it, and that's the great thing about Wellington. He was so strong when things were bad. So during the winter of 1812, while Napoleon was in Russia, what were we doing with this shattered, retreated army? Well, the Army Medical Department and McGrigor and Guthrie, they kept casualties with their own battalions, not in big hospitals. They segregated soldiers with clean wounds from contagion. They had mobile sort of flat-pack hospitals shipped out from Britain to accommodate 1,000 cases, which is really a brilliant idea. And of course, Wellington had the complete confidence of MacGregor by now, and vice versa. And with the increasing surgical experience and warming up the troops and feeding them, they had the idea that the Army Medical Department had injected a division of men back into Wellington's army for the 1813 campaign. And it's worthwhile pointing out something that you all know, I'm sure, that only 1 in 5 deaths in the British Army were caused by battle injury. In the Navy, it was even less. Only 6,000 out of 103 matelots and marines perished in this war from combat injury. And this, of course, was reversed by World War I. Now, unfortunately, before the successful 1813 campaign by Wellington, Guthrie was ordered down to Lisbon, much to his chagrin. But he went there, did his duty as overall sort of medicine-in-chief, medical man-in-chief down there, and he wrote a paper on disarticulation of the shoulder. This is one of Charles Bell's pictures from he was a brilliant artist, and he illustrated his books with his own pictures. He also, Guthrie, wrote papers on the low incidence of TB in Iberia, the local disease patterns, and treating syphilis without mercury. So he didn't waste time down there. Meanwhile, Wellington had hooked north of the French, defeated Jourdan and Joseph at Vittoria in another tremendous action, laid siege to San Sebastian and Pamplona, and prepared for the Pyrenean campaign. Now, of course, Lisbon was far too far away for the base now, and logistically it was much better to deal with the north coast of Spain, so everything was shifted up to Santander. Guthrie moved up and took charge of the biggest hospital there, ready to receive all the casualties coming from the east. One of the things he invented was a long leg splint, which moved from the hip to the ankle, so that it covered the injured bone. It protected the joint above and below the fracture. Obviously, with the short splints then in fashion in the army, there was going to be a lot of malunion, shortening, and deformity. The siege of San Sebastian was a pretty bad affair, again, and you can see the helplessness of a young assistant surgeon of the 1st Lifeguards coming to help a senior compatriot who's fallen in the breach. And there's very little you can do on spot. The great thing is to get the man out. Across the Pyrenees, things were very difficult. Cavalry were virtually useless, and so they were dismounted and their horses used to transport the sick and injured and bring supplies up. Wellington actually hired 18,000 mules at $1 a day for his logistical issues. So now we're moving up to the Pyrenees, the Nivelle, Nive. We invest Bayonne. We fight the Battle of Orthez, and then go on finally to Toulouse, crossing into France. And Marshal Soult was defending Toulouse, and it was a pretty bloody affair. And after the event, Guthrie was given one major hospital, and of the NCOs and private soldiers that were admitted to his hospital were just over 1,200, and 146 of them died. That's a mortality of 11%, which is amazing when you think of what little these people had to offer in the way of therapy. And then it was all over. Guthrie goes home, he joins his family, he looks for some private practice, he's given an honorary consultancy at the York Hospital. But the ogre comes back, and in March he broke away from Elba. Bonaparte landed on the south of France, and the Allies fled to their armies to start all over again. Guthrie was asked to join the Waterloo campaign because Wellington was now commanding the Anglo-Dutch-German force against Bonaparte's Armée du Nord. Guthrie refused to go. He'd had enough. He was exhausted. But about a fortnight after both MacGregor and Wellington had begged him to come, he changed his mind, sort of saying, well, I suppose there are a few things I'd like to clear up. So he went to Waterloo. Now, Waterloo was fought on, as you know, on June the 18th, 1815. There were other actions in the campaign as well. The Allies had a 3-mile battle line facing south, facing the French, who were a kilometre away. We had a big 7,000 capacity field hospital behind Wellington's line. There were 3 outposted farms which were attacked and defended all day, which held some cover for casualties. But men were very exposed on the field of Waterloo, and the big French barrage at the beginning of the action, the only way you could survive round-shot injuries was if you had a limb avulsion. This is one of Bell's paintings again. And there's not a lot you can do with a wound like that. You can trim it up and dress it, and fortuitously you can't close it, because that would be the worst thing to do, obviously. So tangential strikes also could be survived. There was a major French infantry assault after the ground battery had finished firing, and this was repelled by Picton's division and a British cavalry advance. There was another big infantry attack by the French at the end of the day, when the Imperial Guard went up the hill to assault Wellington's right centre. They were again, with difficulty, repulsed. But the point about this is that infantry fire and musket balls are the commonest cause of wounding in a soldier presenting alive to a surgeon on the battlefield. And here you can see an old wound. This is 2 or 3 days old, with a lot of swelling, compound fracture of the tibia and fibula, and it will necessitate an above-knee amputation. You can see that the surgeon's run out of splints, and he's using a bundle of straw, the limb held on with adhesive tape. But gunshot wounds were the most common injuries presenting. And 75% of injuries during this battle fell on the limbs. Of course, there were cavalry assaults. The repulse of d'Erlon's corps by the 2 heavy infantry brigades, cavalry brigades here. You can see one of the Scots Greys troopers, and you can see that he's using his weapon in a chopping, slicing way. So these kind of injuries that Bell has illustrated usually fall around the head, neck, and upper limbs and shoulders. And they were relatively easy to treat. The head and neck obviously has a decent blood supply. But the heavy cavalry of the French used pointed weapons. They also had the 9-foot lance, and these inflicted different kinds of penetrating injuries. Many of these could be survived unless a vital organ or body cavity was breached. Here you can see such a wound caused by a pointed sabre, and the bowel was replaced inside without anesthesia and relaxation, and the 2 ends of colon were joined together on the surface, and this soldier remarkably survived. So these are the different kinds of wounds given by cavalry. By the end of the day, we had 55,000 killed and wounded men over an area of 2.5 square miles. There were 6,000 dead and wounded horses on that battlefield. And one cannot imagine the apocalyptic feeling everyone must have had. That is a medical man here. And it took 4 days to clear the Allied wounded off the field. And a lot of the French hid away because they didn't want to be captured. But it was a big challenge. And Guthrie arrives 2 weeks later in a consultative role and goes to the hospitals in Brussels. He operates on one King's German Legion infantryman who nobody can stop bleeding from a deeply seated artery, so he does. He controls that. He then treats a Hanoverian soldier who he sends home because he's got a musket ball in the bladder, and this is removed by the perineal route in the York Hospital, and Guthrie achieved that in 2.5 minutes in front of a large audience when he got home. But his triumph was Francois De Gay. This is a French infantryman, a prisoner of war, who'd had a case shot through his left hip, which had taken off the top of the femur and disrupted the hip joint. And De Gay not unnaturally refused surgery and then eventually agreed when he realized the outcome was going to be appalling. So he agreed, and this is the kind of magnitude of surgery of the day that was performed without anesthesia. It took half an hour. Guthrie had 2 good assistants, and the patient lost 700 mils of blood, but in 2 days was eating mutton chops and broth, and was eventually packed off back to Les Invalides in Paris as a great marker of British surgery. So what were Guthrie's achievements in combat surgery? Digital vascular control during surgery, surgery of wounded arteries, properly control of the bleeding, post-mortem observations that he'd made on the proximal spread of sepsis in lymphatics in the venous channels, long limb splinting, conservative surgery, wherever possible, avoid amputation if you can, even leaving the patient with a flail limb, the first properly recorded successful hip disarticulation, management of chest wounds, fasciotomy for septic swollen limbs, and importantly, statistical analysis of the results of surgeons in major and smaller hospitals. After the war, he gave gratis lectures to military surgeons for over 15 years because he was devastated by the lack of government initiative to set up a chair of military surgery and a medical teaching school for the Army and Navy. His commentaries on the surgery of the war, which was a great volume, were very well illustrated. It was obviously adapted into 7 or 8 editions, and it was used as standard text through the American Civil War, right up to the Franco-Prussian War. He founded the Westminster Royal Eye Hospital by royal patronage and became, amazingly for this robust military surgeon, an ophthalmic surgeon. He was the youngest member elected onto College Council at the age of 39. He was given a consulting post at the Westminster Hospital and he founded their medical school. He turned down a knighthood but agreed very happily to receive fellowship of the Royal Society. He was Vice President of the Royal College of Surgeons on 5 occasions, President on 3 occasions, and he was involved in the Anatomy Act and charitable efforts. Here we can see him in his 50s, lecturing in his characteristic striped gown. People flocked to his lectures, not only because they were good and interesting, but also because you were not able to be examined by your lecturer, and Guthrie was known to be an extremely robust examiner. Anyway, here we see Guthrie 5 years before his death, a lovely daguerreotype of the man, and his image tells us so much about his character. In the Peninsular War, it was rumoured that Guthrie had treated around 20,000 patients and had certainly performed a big effort towards militarisation, along with MacGregor, in the army. So this fine surgeon, robust, kind, committed, died in 1856 on his 71st birthday. Nicknamed the English Larry, he'd done so much for military medicine. His wife predeceased him. She died 10 years earlier of cholera, and one of his sons, a clergyman, died of a stroke just 3 years before he did, and one died afterwards of alcoholic liver disease. So Larry's name does live on. We think there's a relative. He did marry again just before he died, and we think there's a relative in Australia. So, Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, please let us not forget the extraordinary efforts, not only of today's surgical teams, but of our military and medical predecessors, particularly George James Guthrie, after whom this lecture is entitled. Thank you.